All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our next book event where we'll be discussing sexual politics in revolutionary England. I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the executive director for the NACBS. I'm just going to briefly introduce our guests today, and then I'm going to turn it over to them for a sort of informal conversation. After that, we're going to open it up to Q&A. So if at any point you have a question, you can drop it in the chat, and then we'll start with those when we open up the Q&A, or you can just wait until that part of the session and then you raise your Zoom hand, a little emoji, to let us know you've got a question. So today we are joined by Sam Fullerton, who is the Assistant Professor of History at the University of North Texas. In addition to his work on the sexual politics of the English Revolution, he has published on such topics as royalist print culture, transatlantic anti-Puritanism, and the history of libel. His most recent article, which examines the mid-17th century origins of English pornography, appeared in the Journal of Modern History in September of 2024. His current book project is a history of political libel during the English Revolution, and he earned his PhD from the University of California, Riverside in 2019. So welcome, Sam. Thanks for joining us. And he is going to be joined today in conversation by Jamie Gianoutsos, who is Associate Professor of History at Mount St. Mary's University in Maryland, specializing in early modern Britain, including intellectual history, the history of gender, culture, and political thought. Her first book, The Rule of Manhood, Tyranny, Gender, and Classical Republicanism in England, 1603 to 1660, was the co-winner of the István Prize for Best Book in Intellectual History. Her next book, currently under contract with Penguin Classics UK, provides an exploration for academic and popular audiences of the long classical Republican tradition in England, America, France, and Haiti. For future projects, she is also researching the role of the newspaper in the development of Republican thought and conceptions of medical knowledge and Republican citizen bodies in the 17th century. So welcome to Jamie also, and I will turn it over to you guys.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to chat about this book, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to have Sam introduce his book more to everyone. So I didn't know if we should just start, Sam, if you want to just kind of give us the elevator pitch description of what your book is about, and we'll kind of start there.
Yeah, and I should say thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's a wonderful chance to talk about something I was just saying before we started to Jamie and Amanda that I put this book away for the last few months, very happily, not thinking about it after the long work of revision and publication. So it's been a real treat to have this on the calendar to think about returning to it with a less weary brain. So the book is a history of really a category of transgressive speech language, that is to say, explicit sex talk, and particularly explicit sex talk as it pertains to politics, religion, and the state. I can talk about how I got to this project later if there's interest in that. I mean, it's a sort of it's an idiosyncratic story for a number of ways, I think. But what the book does is it looks at this language, which is largely absent from what we might call sort of public culture prior to the outbreak of civil war in the 1640s. That is to say, print in particular, in Parliament, these spaces that are public spaces by a variety of definitions. And it looks at how, by a variety of mechanisms and thanks to a variety of circumstances, the outbreak of civil war propels explicit sex talk into print, into public conversation, and from there sort of transforms it into a premier language of public discourse over the course of the 20 years separating the outbreak of war from the restoration of Charles II. So the book looks at that language, and particularly uses that language to think about politics, about the political history of the revolutionary period, with a couple of goals in mind, right? The first is to argue that sex talk, that what I refer to as sexual politics, is a useful, and I would argue an essential tool for understanding a wide range of different contexts through which the revolution unfolds. And again, the chapters, the book proceeds chronologically, but the chapters are separated thematically. So partisan stereotyping, mobilization, debates over religious toleration, monarchy, etc. The second argument has to do with the Restoration period, right? This moment when I think, according to plenty of political historians and most historians of Western sexuality, really inaugurated a new era in the history of sexuality, right? The beginning of modern sexual culture. And there are a variety of folks who've written about this. The most recent is Pierre de Boivella, who uses the Restoration as kind of the keystone moment to kick off his 2012 book, The Origins of Sex. And so I argue in this book that emphasis on the singular nature of the Restoration in this respect overlooks the really consequential motivations and maneuvers of a generation of Civil War pamphleteers who basically put this language into action in such a way that more or less anticipates all the significant developments in Restoration sexual politics by a decade or two. The final intervention, the most speculative, the one that I spend the least time on because I think is probably the hardest claim to validate, is that what we get from this story is a reminder that when we're talking about the history of sexuality on the broadest possible scale, that we have to pay attention to politics. And I recognize that is something that has been done, right? But in particular, I think this book makes the case that quotidian politics, day-to-day choices by individual quasi-rational actors can have the potential to dramatically shape long-term, large-scale narratives about how culture changes. So that is the sort of final suggestion of the book. And I make this case through a basically chronological, close political history of the 20 years of revolution, as well as a little bit before and a little bit after.
Yeah, thanks. I know that a perennial issue of interest to people is how dissertations become books and what that process looks like. I think I heard you finished your PhD in 2019. So I didn't know if you would mind just telling us about that process for you and how this project developed, maybe from your time at AC Riverside.
Yeah. So this project, it is my dissertation project. It started, I came in, the strange origins of this, at least the initial version of this project, date from basically my first year in grad school. I got to Riverside having basically never taken any coursework in either early modern history or in English history. I was a genocide studies person as an undergraduate and decided that I didn't have the emotional fortitude to handle a career working on some really heavy stuff. I didn't have the languages either. There were other reasons, but I came to Riverside with a really impoverished understanding of the period and I think a skill set that needed real refining. And so my advisor, Tom Cogswell, set me off to search for sort of this trend of again the appearance of highly graphic sex talk in print in the early stages of the Civil War, and I sort of ran with it. But that is to say, this has been with me basically as long as I've been an early modern English historian, and I think that probably has a lot to do with how it's turned out. Yes, I finished the dissertation in 2019. In December 2019 is when I graduated, and I immediately went to Vanderbilt for a postdoc with Peter Lake. That postdoc saved my life, right? I got there in January, and we know what happened next. And so I had 2 years, two years of funding and security to think about changing, revising the text. And again, I have to credit Peter for a lot of that, for the advice to set it aside for a while, which I did, which was useful for again sort of refocusing and reframing. In terms of the sort of technical changes, I rewrote the book twice. I rewrote it first at Vanderbilt in an effort to make it something certainly not popular, but something more broadly accessible, something that was a little less mired in the historiography and a little more general. And that was a failure. I mean, that was it was a disaster. I realized several years later, and so I returned to it after leaving Vanderbilt and returning to Riverside as a lecturer. The changes as they have now resulted, structure is basically the same as the dissertation. I expanded. The dissertation had one chapter on the entire interregnum in the early Restoration period. That became, in this book, 3 chapters. Probably the most important chapters of the book, I think, or in a lot of ways the most important chapters of the book. And in other places, there were pretty substantial cuts. But I think while the analysis, particularly in the second half of the book, changed or at least expanded pretty dramatically, the difference, the usefulness of taking that time away was really just a question of focus, I think, and of recognizing precisely where the interventions would be most significant. And that mattered because this material is everywhere, right? I mean, I think, Jamie, you can attest to the fact that sex talk as that broad category is really omnipresent in these sources. And so figuring out what to do with it in a way that made sense and wasn't unnecessarily or impractically broad took a lot of time. And I mean, that's not something I succeeded with in the dissertation, but it is something that I think the book does a lot better.
Yeah, there really is I definitely think the book has a kind of encyclopedic reach. And I mean that, and there's just a lot of material here. And I think that scholars will find it very useful to mine your sources as they move forward. And I think you would probably welcome that to increase the number of people who are really taking this kind of talk seriously. I didn't know if we could talk about 2 terms that you use in the book. And I think that you see a very large shift happening in chapter 3 around these terms. And I would love you if you could talk more about it. So you use the term sex talk, and then you also use the term pornopolitics. And it seems like in chapter 3, you think that pornopolitics is developing, and that part of what you say is that the sources move from description to explanation. And so I didn't know if you could talk about the shift you see happening, and if I've gotten that right in the 3rd chapter, but that seemed to be an important point for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right that in my mind, I mean, the case that I try to make is that if sex talk is the broad category, right? I mean, encyclopedic to get back to that adjective, right? If sex talk is the broad category of invocations of these languages of the body, the sexual body, and taken and therefore applied to all sorts of different contexts. Pornopolitics seems to me to be an intensification of that rhetoric in a couple of very specific ways. And it is, I think, probably, I mean, these pornopolitics are contingent upon some really novel political circumstances that if not unique to the revolutionary period, are aligned very closely with those transformations, which is why, right, it takes until really the beginning of the crisis that would culminate in the regicide for them to make their presence felt. But yeah, my sense is that what sets that pornopolitical category apart is that up until that moment in the story, we see partisan polemicists, again, from across the spectrum, really reaching for all sorts of relatively conventional, if not, I mean, I think increasingly graphic and explicit sexual labels to often, right, denigrate the opposition. And those are labels that circulate in less public forms prior to the outbreak of war, but which spring into print again with the sort of late 1630s, early 1640s, the initial crisis. Those uses of sex talk, again, the invention of some of these partisan labels, right? The ways in which this language is used to mobilize support for competing causes during the early to mid 1640s. That language, I find, is often descriptive, right? It is language that is used more often than not to classify or to clarify general attitudes about generally an opposing party, right? To slot people into categories of religious categories, political categories, and to apply these abusive labels as a way of delineating between groups. Porno politics, in my brain, the way that this language is different is that it allows contemporary polemicists, and again, this is a multi it's applicable across these different ideological positions. People use these tools differently, but at the same sort of caliber, the same timbre. Porno politics allows polemicists to use sex talk as a way of if not of enacting political change, of explaining political change in ways that I think other forms of discourse fail to do effectively. And so the key example, I think, is this question coming from Carol Pateman, right? The sexual contract, this notion of king as husband, kingdom as wife, and explaining the schism, right, between these two political actors. Like, there is no better tool than adultery, right, to really get at the collapse of this formerly harmonious, at least in the idealized imagination, arrangement. And so in using and turning to these metaphors, Mistress Parliament, right, or on the parliamentarian side, the sort of rapist tyrant that we see, that people have done so much good work on for the Restoration, for Charles II. It just seems to me that those analytical tools go beyond merely describing what is happening, right? They, in fact, like almost perfectly embody, maybe that's a weird verb, but almost perfectly represent what is happening in a way that I think lots of other contemporaries, or rather lots of other political languages struggle to do in this period. So I suppose that's what I mean, is that again, you can align this language of sex, of adultery, of generation, of pregnancy and birth so neatly with a certain set of readings about how the kingdom is falling apart, right, at that critical period in the late 1640s, early 1650s, that sex becomes kind of the most effective way to talk about serious constitutional issues, right? So that is the distinction I draw in my brain.
Yeah, I mean, I thought we should like camp some on that. I on that thought too about discussions of things like adultery and the political theory. Tyrant rapist clearly is a theme that I've worked a long time on as well. One area that I think we might disagree a bit, that I think might be an interesting conversation, is in your book, in the 4th chapter, when you talk about the regicide. If anyone wants a page number, if they have, it's on page 172 at the top. I made a note, but I read it on my Kindle, so I can't dramatically open my book. But you talk about this really significant moment where you think that the language has gone from being tame to become much more clearly pornographic. And you also note the significant moment when Charles I himself gets accused of adultery. And that's not really, possible so much in the 1640s, or at least it doesn't seem like people are calling out Charles's chastity in particular prior to regicide and the work of people like John Milton to justify the regicide. I was surprised by that discussion of tameness for allusions to tyrannical lust and allusions earlier, because on the one hand, I don't think, for example, that the Nero stories I look at are tame at all, right? Like, in fact, some of them are, I mean, Nero supposedly murders his mother, undresses her, and then with interest talks about like, that's the womb I came from. And there are unbelievable pornographic elements of some of those stories that have already been in print, right? And then on the other hand, on that issue, I actually think the charge of uxoriousness is worse than the charge of adultery when it comes to political theory in the 1640s and 50s. Because kings, Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines, right? So, I mean, like there had been a long history of dealing with conceptions of monarchical sexuality and what that looks like in a lot of different models. But like for a king to be ruled by a popish wife seems even a greater constitutional crisis in reality, and simultaneously a really significant charge in political theory that he's not ruling. So I don't know your thoughts. You can say why you see that turning point and defend adultery as worse than uxoriousness, but I'll pass it back to you on those.
Yeah. So okay. Let me make sure I had to order a copy
Okay, good.
for myself
Yeah.
because I just gave all mine away. But I'm looking at
Yeah.
that moment, and I
Yeah.
think so that when I use that language of tameness in this particular moment,
Yeah.
what I was suggesting is that the allegation of um, uh, Charles's unchastity was tame in comparison to these other polemics of accusing him of tyranny, of
Okay.
treason. So
Okay. I maybe misread that lane. I was like, that's not tame. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. No. I mean, so in that sense, right? Like that particular claim seems relatively minor given the things that have already been said about Charles in print. Um, yeah, I mean, Exorus, I don't disagree with you. I don't think. I mean, I think as a metaphor for constitutional crisis, I think adultery is very powerful. And again, I think it is unique when situated within this language that marries, right, the king and his people. Um, I don't, I don't feel compelled, I think, to like, I agree with you that exoriousness is a serious charge. And I mean, again, in my mind, we see versions of these allegations. Um, exoriousness uh, can be read in terms of sex talk, right? I mean, the danger is through the bedchamber, right? The 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 reason that a king is enthralled to his Catholic wife has everything to do with what goes on behind closed doors, right?
Yeah.
And so in that sense, no, I don't disagree. And I think, there are moments, there's that famous line from Henry Parker in 43 where he talks about the queen's got her hands on the king's scepter, which seems to be like, again, Parker, I think, is being perfectly clear for where he's sitting at that moment, that is a sexual metaphor that is about, right, undue control being exercised just physically uh, in the king's bedchamber. And there are other, there's other stuff in the 40s, stuff that's circulating in manuscript um, early in the period among the Scots that suggest as much too. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't want to fight you on that. I think
Yeah, no. And I don't mean it as a fight, but I do think it highlights how much what they're using to smear has such a relational component. And the gendering that's going on can be multivalent, right? And so there are I once had a person ask me, 10 years ago, how is it that someone being over lusty and someone being under lusty could both be a failing of masculinity, and those are somehow on the same spectrum, right? And I think this is part of what's going on with uxoriousness versus adultery, you know what I mean? So there are challenging relationships between these different sexual acts, but I guess that the move to charge Charles personally with marital infidelity, I do think is really striking. And I think it does um, it does show a distinction or something new that's happened with the regicide. But simultaneously, I do think that the usurpation through uxoriousness seems like a really significant boundary they've crossed already, right? And like the 10 years before. So like related to some of these questions about how you deal with this kind of range of different kinds of sex talk you're talking about. There are kind of two different lines of thought I wanted to ask about. One of them is that I have to say honestly, as a female reader, it's a little bit challenging when we talk about the period as sex drenched and kind of go through all of the different ways that sex is being talked about. When I do see some of the discussions as really, really different, right? So in the 1640s and 50s, on the one hand, we have people reporting actual sex crimes that soldiers are committing against women in towns as they march, right? And you know, sexual assault in war is a war crime. They didn't maybe call it that then, but it's clear that when they're reporting it, they do see it as a type of war crime, as a violation of cities, towns, virgins, families, and as a type of tyranny, right? Like that's kind of going with that line. That just feels so very different from discussions of reformed circles where there are brethren, sisters, or ranters who are having perhaps more consensual sex. It's going to be horrifying to certain audiences, but where female participation is women are asking to be engaged in this. And so, you made the decision in the book to kind of talk of all of these things together, which is, I think, valuable in a way because they all are a spectrum of sex talk. But I also, at the same time, I felt, I don't know, should we be making like more distinctions between involuntary and rape, sexuality, rape and violence, and kind of fear of consensual circles of sexuality? And I'm sure you've thought and wrestled about this a lot. So I wanted to open up your thoughts on that and how will we deal with this range of sources?
Yeah, no, I think a totally valid take. And well, let me say that when I wrote the dissertation, the last chapter of the dissertation was, 70 pages of I mean the reason it didn't make the book, but the reasoning at the time was we've got these discourses in print, in manuscript and oral culture. How do they align, or what's the relationship with what we find in the sort of more traditional sources of social history, right? So I spent basically 5 months going through every extant set of quarter sessions from the period in county record offices, and what the sort of assize records that remain for the period as well. And I did a lot of work tabulating all this stuff because I was aware, I remain aware, right, that there are not there's a vast gap in many ways between the lived experience of people, particularly women, right, and the way that particularly or predominantly male writers discuss them in these texts. And what struck me most, I mean, this is a deviation slightly from where I'm headed, but looking at the assize records in the National Archives, when you go through those volumes, I don't know who's done this, and there's a person named Talia Sarna who's written a great dissertation at Brown on sex crime and sexual violence during the wars. Someone has identified all of the cases of sexual assault and placed them in folders so that as you're approaching them in the these big boxes of stuff, what is coming. and I had a very visceral reaction to that going through those records. I don't know, you know, the way that I've done this, which is to say, throw everything in, right? I mean, parse it in terms of the way that we read this stuff at different points in the story based on these themes or historiographical issues. I think it is important to appreciate just how the volume of this stuff, right? As it appears in all of these different guises. And I think something that I don't say explicitly in the book, but something that has really driven the way that I think about the impact of this material, so much of which are these you know, again, really quotidian, really sort of small stakes interventions into this conversation, is that the volume of this stuff really matters, right? That these are trivial interventions, but they're not inconsequential, particularly when they come at such a high rate, and in so many forms. And so I think there's value to taking it all in together. But I think, and I you know, I hope that folks come to this book and say, well, there's significantly more to be done here, here, and here. And really in response to your particular point here, that dissertation, Talia's dissertation, I think I saw Tim's name in the chat list, so he knows, which is it's about sexual violence as it occurs on the ground during this period, and it's about the ways in which that language is applied in the sort of political contexts. That is the work we really need. I mean, I think that sort of work, which can be, you can do that for any number of these, I think, strains of argument. There's a lot of ground to cover there. And I think we can only hope that that's what comes next. But no, I mean, I totally acknowledge where you're coming from. And there were moments where I really, you know, it's how do the problem of positioning yourself as a male author, right? Looking at this stuff in particular, positioning yourself in a way that like recognizes how challenging and how alarming a lot of this material is, and juxtaposing that feeling with in a lot of cases, the sort of really frivolous attitude taken by these partisan pamphleteers, even as they're discussing really traumatic moments. So, you know, I know I take your point, and I can only hope that there's more stuff coming, you know.
Yeah, and I think there will be, and I actually think this book is going to be like a really important spark to encourage more. I mean, I saw my own work as trying to push that you really shouldn't be writing about this period unless you're thinking about gender as part of your discussion. It doesn't have to be an entirely, you know, gender focus, but it needs to be a central part. And I appreciated that. That's a very clear conclusion that you draw as well, and I think really powerfully. I would like to ask one more thing, and then we could open it up to others. So what I thought was really interesting was how much religio-political language is clearly intertwined in its use of sex talk and in the ramifications of its sex talk, especially in the 1640s. And you point out a lot how much the reformational discourses about anti-popery, anti-Puritan language become almost a constant through this period. In the 1660s, though, I thought one of the big stories here, and you know, I don't expect you to do tons post 1660 because you've done so much encyclopedic work up to then, but I mean, it's very clear how the work you've done thinking about gosh, now I'm finding my words. The royalist writing about romance and kind of cavalier sexuality then links into a merry monarch image with Charles II. But I actually think another part of this story that's fascinating is how much that then gets splintered. You don't carry the story of the Quakers as much, but clearly the Quakers actually get persecuted horrifically, and charges of bestiality against the Quakers and charges related to the ranters that then get used to persecute the Quakers go into very full swing, and then of course we get all the way to the Popish plot. And so at the same time that the court seems to be doing the moves you described, the other kind of strand that you've been following also intensifies in a persecuting, or maybe not intensifies, but continues and maybe intensifies in a persecuting way. And so I didn't know your thoughts on how we see that split occur in the 1660s, and what your work shows about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say you're right that I've not thought about this side of that story as much as I have about the court. And I should, I should say that has a lot to do, I think, with the way that historians talk about sexual culture in the Restoration, right? Which again was sort of like a target from the beginning of this project. But no, I do think that's true that side of the story carries through into the 1680s. That we see, that print, Lestrange's The Dissenters, right? Which is, I think I mentioned probably the very last page of the Restoration, the like 11-page Restoration chapter. I had not looked at that very closely, really through the first few years I was working on this project. But to find so many of those images, not just Naylor, right, but the Quaker and the cult, these again, pretty explicit invocations of anti-Puritan, anti-sectarian sexual politics, replicated 20 or 25 years later, was remarkable to me. I mean, I sort of expected to look for it, and then was still surprised when I found it. One thing that I've thought about this a little bit more specifically is that I wrote this piece that's out in the JMH now on it's about pornography. It's about erotic writing rather than about the politics of this language, although the two things go hand in hand. And what I've done there is zoomed in on one figure, this figure of the Holy Sister. And what we can see, right, is we can see the ways in which a variety of commentators discuss this caricature, right, this anti-Puritan trope. I mean, originally, it serves sort of both sides of the Reformation divide, but it becomes linked to the anti-Puritan position more exclusively. You can watch that language carry through into the 1680s and 1690s with just as much vitriol, right? I mean, even more arguably, before you reach a point in the mid 18th century, basically, where the hypersexuality of that character is finally decoupled from her religious commitments, right? And so, I think there's probably something to be said there, or there's a way to apply that model to a whole host of these tropes. And that doesn't take into account, right, the changes that the Quakers themselves make in reaction to some of these persecutory claims. That's like not a great answer, but I guess my point is I'm totally with you, and I think someone should do some work on it.
Amanda, do you want to open up the Q&A?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So if anyone's got a question, please go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll call on you. Elizabeth, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Thank you so much. I can't wait to read the book. I noticed that the audience here is a lot of people who work on other things related to early modern England. And what is the biggest misconception we've all been laboring under that we need to address in our work based on your new book?
Elizabeth, that's a great question. I think I can answer. I mean, the sort of like not helpful answer is that I think sex talk as a form of political commentary is like pretty pervasively underappreciated. The specific example, or the more specific example or argument I would make is that I think if you look at a whole host of 20th and early 21st century political histories of the revolution. So like the books that we know and love that are super detailed and, have everything we need to know when it comes to sort of the maneuvers, the political positions, how they change when it comes to this period. They almost, I should say probably not comprehensively, but it feels like comprehensively neglect, I think to Jamie's earlier points, the seriousness of gender, right, as a category of political action or as an influence on political action. And I would say the same thing for sex talk, that we have really decades of people writing very close political narratives of this 20-year period that pay little or no attention to what is, I think, a fundamental way of thinking about politics. Like you cannot talk about politics in the 17th century without thinking about gender. And I think sex talk is another useful tool to bring to that conversation. So, I guess I think this is more of a revolution problem than it is a 17th century problem. It's more of a historian's problem than it is a literary scholar's problem. But political history and early modern political history has to account for these things. And I think to date it really hasn't, with some some notable exceptions.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Any other questions? So we've got one in the chat that I will read for you from Dave Fogg-Postel. He says, how would you both envisage the scatological and humanistic context, classical antiquity, intersecting? Also, quasi equals rational. Would you expand on that?
Sure, yeah. So I think Jamie's probably better suited to answer that first question than I am. But one thing that I think the area of the analysis that I feel least qualified to commentate on is the sort of the classical inheritance that a lot of this material is drawing on. And I can give a specific example. Milton's allegations about Charles's sexuality, right? And particularly the debate with Salmasius in the early 1650s, I think is freighted in this classical tradition that embraces some incredibly caustic forms of libelous sexual allegations. Granted, they're being in this case written mostly in Latin. But there is a relationship there that continues through this period. If we want to talk about humanism, one thing that strikes me, or one thing that I make something of in the early parts of the book, is that there is this humanist Erasmian notion of civility that I think serves prior to the outbreak of civil war and early in that period of the sort of collapse of constitutional norms in the late 30s and early 40s. The Erasmian notion of civility is being challenged, right, pretty explicitly by some of these writers. And we get eventually, by the early 1650s, people who are quite willing to sort of set that assumption aside and embrace the possibility that sex talk maybe has a place in political discourse. And again, I think Jamie can probably say much more about that first question. I'll just say on the second question. Oh, sorry, go ahead. No,
please go ahead. Answer the second one, Sam.
Well, I was just going to say this: the second, quasi-rational. I don't want to put too much emphasis on that that distinction. Rational works just as well for me. But I guess my point is that the driving engine for these changes, in my mind, really comes down to, as I said earlier, individual choices made at relatively in relatively quick succession, spur of the moment, sort of polemical interventions, right, back and forth, dialogic exchanges that invoke a heightening, increasingly heightening timbre and intensity, these various lexicons of sexual politics. So again, the quasi, that maybe is not as important to me as I maybe shouldn't have said that, but my point is, these actors are engaged in a series of very short-term conversations they are mostly not thinking about the long-term consequences of, as I argue, normalizing this language of explicit sex talk. And I follow some very good literary scholars who've argued, right? Valerie Traub writes this great book, has this great thing about the sort of nascent sexual public that emerges. That is fully visible anyway by the 1660s. And I guess if I'm going to qualify, quasi-rational, what I mean by that basically is that I think most of the pamphleteers responsible for normalizing this language are not thinking about the sort of the possibility of a nascent sexual public in the 1640s. Sorry, Jamie, please.
Oh no, it's your book launch event, so I don't have to. You're the star. I would if Dave is interested, I would say that I think these contexts intersect all along in a really powerful ways through the Renaissance and beyond. If you look at the really important work that other scholars have done, and that's some of my own work looks at what schoolboys are actually cutting their teeth on educationally, and what's happening in places like grammar schools, colleges, Inns of Court. Many of them are using and kind of living through classical antique texts, and then through that producing a whole range of porno-political conversations or satire and bawdiness. So people who've done work on the for example, how they're taking Juvenalian satire, or how they're taking different kinds of ancient comedians and putting on their shows in these spaces. They are kind of acting out or discussing very lewd things, but through through these kind of historical contexts. Or if you look at how people, for example, talk about Tarquin, the tyrant rapist, you can look to Shakespeare, you can look to Haywood's play. All of these things are happening like as early as the 1590s. And so there's this intersection here going on where they're talking about sexual violence, for example, and the humanist or classical antique past simultaneously, or in the Nero stories. And some of these can be more libelous and some of these can be more historical. I think what Sam's book shows really interestingly are the point at which they are very clearly identifying real life people in England who are in politics right now as participating in these activities. And a lot of the work I've done, I think they are implicating the monarchs, and I think at times they're implicating them pretty clearly, but it's not naming the name of the monarch and then stating who he's betting this week. So there definitely is like a shift where the scatological takes on a different vein than what we find in the humanistic texts. But just like Sam notes, like there's also a back history to how the Reformation is talking about Puritans or anti-popery languages. There's a backstory to a lot of these scatological languages in these other contexts. So the book doesn't deny that, but I think it does show important moments where you can name names in print like you couldn't do prior to the 1640s.
Thanks to both of you. Great. Any other questions? And you can also feel free to type them out in the chat if you'd prefer, and I'll read them out. So what about the Licensing Act?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a running theme in this book. I mean, something that I think has not been, well, I shouldn't say that. Something that interests me a lot. That's something that I think is kind of hard to pinpoint, and that I suspect there are people that will take issue with, is this idea that we can see throughout the 1640s, starting in mid 1643, really the moment when all these folks who've written recently about mobilization see new and interesting things being attempted, mostly on Parliament's behalf as tools of generating support for the cause. We can see from that moment through the 1650s, really, this this I shouldn't say genre, this language being adopted and pretty explicitly endorsed by people in the nodes of power, both in London and in Oxford up until 1646. That is to say that we can, I think, identify moments when um, official acceptance of this language, and official, I think, is the tricky word, right? But official acceptance of this language is visible, that we can see people in charge saying, yes, this is a tool that we can use, which in my eyes is a pretty dramatic shift from, again, this pre-war period when most folks seem opposed to the most explicit forms of this discourse. So we can see talk about licensing in a different context, right? We can watch as basically Parliament rubber stamps people who are very happy to use this language in new and interesting and increasingly transgressive ways in texts that bear formal regime licenses. So that is one thing. I know that's not what you're asking. As for the Licensing Act itself, more particularly that moment in September 1649, I think that there is a watershed there, which is to say that if the predominant form of sex talk, or one of the dominant forms of sex talk to appear in print during the 1640s is libelous, as Jamie was sort of suggesting. The Licensing Act makes that more difficult for royalists who are chafed by the regicide and the rise of this new republic. And so we see changes. We see different forms of sexual politics emerging among royalist pamphleteers who are, working at this point mostly from hiding on the or within London. And so the Licensing Act matters because it forces hostile commentators on the Republic to change their tactics. And I argue what we get as a result of that is a new kind of royalist sexual politics, one that is much less directly accusatory and one that's much more mired in a sort of celebration of worldliness as a different kind of repudiation of Republican godly morality. And that in turn feeds what we get at the Restoration. So the Licensing Act certainly matters on my reading.
And so we've got another question from Helen, which says, how does the metaphysics of sex fit into sex talk and political philosophy? So, i.e., one flesh, or marriage and illicit sex as sacrament or not. So, as Jamie suggests, does education or perhaps confession offer any explanation for connections or absence of them?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a great answer off the top of my head. I can answer I can give you a non-answer while I think about it, which is to say I have a very clear memory of, while I was in the initial revisions for this book, talking with someone, and I can't remember the context in which I gave this person who's not a historian a specific example of something I was working on. And I said, well, and on some level, it's just language, right? This is just something that people are saying. And this person who's a therapist said, absolutely not, right? Like sex matters. If we talk about embodiment, right? If we want to talk about the ways in which this set of emotions and activities is no matter how we articulate it, is linked to something that we do or don't do. That, as I say, is a non-answer, but it did make me think a little bit more about the ways in which this language is linked to the experience of the people who are experience and beliefs of the people who are using it so aggressively during this period, who are rendering it so public. And I in terms of the question of education or confession, I'm happy to defer to Jamie again on that point. It's something I have to do some more thinking about. But I think they're there is certainly much to be said there. And I guess particularly when it comes to that question of sex talk and political philosophy, a lot of the really good work that's been done on this question has not been early modern. So there's maybe something to be said there too for borrowing from other corners of the historiography. I know that's not very helpful, but thank you for the question.
There is it's been a while since I've read on this topic. I did read on it when I wrote my Milton chapter, which has now been about 10 years. But I believe it's Turner's book, One Flesh. You might be referring to, Helen. I actually do think there's really interesting metaphysical issues here. Pick up from Sam a bit. So Milton, in his divorce tracts, it doesn't just okay divorce. He actually takes on a pretty long, as you're probably aware, discussion of what is happening in a marriage and what the union should be like between husband and wife. And what he really scoffs at in a lot of the Catholic legal theory that precedes him is how much they focus on the physical act of sexuality and don't really focus on incompatibility spiritually or intellectually between the husband and wife when talking about divorce. And so Milton will say that if you're not truly connected with your spouse on the metaphysical level, you then will go to the stews and will become licentious because you don't have that deeper connection. And so he does see these as bound up together. So a lot of what I see in my work has to do less with, I make the move that they're not trying to get rid of a patriarchal politics, but they're trying to say Republicans do patriarchal politics better. And that this kind of conversation in the home and a patriarchal setup in the home will then relate to a Republican setup in the Commonwealth. And so my sense is that that a lot of the political conversations happening about sex are not always just, sometimes they're taking very old conversations and then trying to transform them into the new political settlement without ridding themselves. But other times, I think when it comes to sacrament, again, this is a little bit, I'm not as sharp as I maybe once was on this, but on the sacramental issue, Milton is going to be denying the sacraments in a Catholic sense, but I still think that what they are giving to marriage metaphysically remains, I think, a little bit closer to a sacramental way of thinking about this union. So anyway, it's a brilliant question, and I think this is another area where I hope there will actually be more work done on what's happening to marriage and conceptions of marriage and politics in the 1650s, because I think it's a radically important moment for this. So thank you. Sorry, it's a half answer, but thank you for raising it.
Well, it's two half answers, so one. So I think that's about time for us. So I want to thank both Jamie and Sam for joining us today. This was a really great discussion, and thank all of you for joining us as well. We've got some great events coming up for the rest of the semester, so check out the schedule. And then I hope everyone will join me in thanking Jamie and Sam for the wonderful talk.
Thanks to you all for coming. Thanks, Amanda, for putting it together. Thank you so much, Jamie, for facilitating the conversation. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. This has been really fun.
Thanks to both of you.